Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. I'm Susan Weinrich, and I work with the New York Council of Nonprofits, and we are partnering with the DHPSNY program to help with some strategic planning and to help with some of the webinars like this. And so in terms of our session today, what we're going to cover is really a focus on, board governance and the board development process that goes along with it. So thank you for joining me on my tropical island. We are going to talk today about how you can think about developing a strategic and proactive approach to board development. We'll talk a little bit about why and how it's important to make the case for board service in your community. We find that people often take it for granted that many people understand why board service matters, how to get involved, what it means to be a board member, and how important it is really to kind of make the case both in terms of your particular organization, but also in terms of board governance and board service. And then we'll really talk about best practices for strategic board development, including assessing the board, its composition, its performance, planning for board recruitment and the nominating process, making sure that you have a good onboarding process, and then helping to ensure that board members stay on the board for their specified period of time, for their terms, and also for building leadership among board members. So just before we move on, a few housekeeping items. There is a chat box, and you can enter in a question, and we'll try to get to your specific questions. There'll be a couple of times throughout the session that I'll just stop and pause and maybe answer some questions if there are any. So please feel free to jump in and ask your question, give some examples if there are things in this webinar that I'm pointing out that maybe really work well for your organization. People can learn from what other organizations are doing as well. Okay, so, I want to start, there's the question about the slides. They will be emailed by Marissa sometime within the next week, so you should be able to get them. And you can certainly share them with your board members as well. So why does the board exist, right? If you think about nonprofits, we don't have owners. We don't have shareholders. We have a board of directors who serve as the fiduciaries for the organization. And essentially what they do is represent the public interest. We're public charities. We have charitable dollars. We have certain benefits at the state and federal level in terms of how grants and contracts are available, in terms of the charitable deductions that people can take, at least theoretically, depending on who's itemizing. And it's important to remember that it's the board, not the staff, who are accountable for how the funds are spent, for ensuring that the organization is compliant legally with the terms of it being a nonprofit, a charitable organization, with not New York State regulations for your charter, with the Attorney General's office. So it's important to remember that the board is accountable for them, not for staff, although you may delegate to staff certain responsibilities. Many organizations, particularly historical societies, don't even have staff. So board members are doing both governance work and operational work. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and about how to address some of those challenges as well. Ultimately, right, the role of the fiduciary is for board members to discharge the duties of their position in good faith and with that degree of diligence, care, loyalty, and skill which ordinarily prudent persons would exercise under similar circumstances in like positions. I like reading that off because I feel like that's the legally defined role of a fiduciary, of a board member, right? And we've hopefully all heard of the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience, right? Which essentially says that the duty of care means you need to pay attention. You need to understand what's going on. You need to attend board meetings. You need to hold board meetings and committee meetings. You need to take minutes of your meetings. You need to document that the board is in fact exercising its due diligence process. The duty of loyalty essentially means that board members need to operate in good faith and basically making sure that they're acting always in the best interest of the organization. And the duty of obedience says we're challenged to follow our policies, to follow our bylaws, to comply with state law and federal law and local laws, to make sure that we can honor the terms of our contracts and to follow our personnel policies and human resources policies. So essentially what it means is that as board members, it's a common sense principle. What would an ordinarily prudent person do who is responsible for the broad governance and oversight of an organization, of its assets, of its collections, of the buildings that maybe you steward? So what does it mean for being a good steward? So just wanted to make sure that was clear to people, because as we go into this conversation, I'm sure many of you are all volunteer organizations. And I think that it's always a challenge for organizations to think distinctively about what constitutes the work of the board in its governance capacity, with the board acting as a collective body where no one has individual rights or the ability to make unilateral decisions, right? And then when you're talking about the management of an organization, you're talking about how activities are carried out. It's usually a person or perhaps a committee who has the ability to provide direction and leadership because they've been given that assignment by the board. And that can be a staff person, can be the executive director, or it can be a volunteer and a board member. And then it's important to recognize that board members and other people as well may serve in a volunteer capacity, that they are basically serving at the direction of the board, at the direction of the manager, that a specific task. And that I think it's important to recognize that when a board member is functioning as a volunteer, they're not functioning in the governance capacity. They're functioning as a volunteer, accountable to whomever is in that management role, whether they're a board member, volunteer, or a paid staff person. Also, when we're looking at all volunteer organizations, it's important to distinguish a little bit further between the board's governance and leadership role and its management role. Because one thing that is important to recognize is that, first of all, you have the fiduciary responsibility of governance, but that management functions, getting the work of the organization done, usually takes precedent, usually is much more interesting, much more engaging to people, in terms of, what's fun about the organization. You're doing mission work much of the time. I think that this distinction is also really important when we talk about board recruitment and we talk about making sure that you're communicating clear expectations to potential board members. Because when some board members are when some prospective board members are thinking about joining a board, they think about their role in governance and leadership, right? On serving on the board, serving on committees, setting organizational policy, developing a strategic plan for the organization, you know, and really managing kind of the governance responsibilities. Whereas other people might want to join the organization because they want to do the work. Maybe they want to help and be a docent, or they want to raise money for the organization. They want to do events for the organization or programming. You know, they are ambassadors for the organization. So I think that just being clear within your own organizations, particularly in all volunteer organizations, but not just, because many organizations are small and they rely on the board members as key volunteers for doing that management work. But it's important to think about board service and what it is you're asking board members to do when they come on. If volunteering operationally is part of that expectation, it's important that you communicate that to people. And it's also important that you don't lose sight of the governance and leadership type of work that needs to happen. So this is just another way of looking at this. In some organizations, right, the overlap and shared responsibilities between the board of directors and the volunteers is very compressed, because maybe there is no executive director, or maybe the board members are serving as the staff and volunteers to a large extent. And I think what's really, again, important is in defining when is the board acting in its fiduciary responsibility by setting policy, developing a strategic plan, developing a fundraising plan and carrying it out, and providing general oversight and compliance for the organization. And when is it really focused on implementation at the volunteer level? If you have an executive director, sometimes it's just important to define these boundaries, these overlapping spheres of shared responsibility. If you have a long-term executive director who your organization relies on, it's, you know, you may give them a lot of leeway in terms of the overlap of responsibility. If you have a new executive director who you don't know as well, the board may play a much more active and engaged role. So just being intentional and thoughtful about where the board's role is, where the executive director's role is, where volunteer positions are really important. And then in defining where are the overlap of those responsibilities, so that you're capturing the knowledge and experience and expertise of the board, as well as staff or the executive director. And you're working together to set policies and carry out the operations of the organization. So as you're thinking about, you know, the board and its responsibilities, we kind of break up the board's major policy and monitoring functions in 7 areas. Board Source maybe does it in 10. They just sort of tease some of these out a little bit more. The one that we're going to be speaking mostly about today is board management and development. Really, the board is ultimately responsible for making sure that it runs smoothly, that it has new board members, that those board members are engaged and informed. So that'll be the piece that we mostly talk about. But you want to think about the board's responsibility, the board's composition, you know, in terms of an area of expertise around human resources. If you have staffing, the board sets personnel policies. The board oversees the executive director, needs to evaluate the executive director. So it's helpful to have people with some HR experience. The board obviously is responsible for the organization's finances and fixed assets. So if you're large enough to require an audit, you know, that's an added extra responsibility with new regulations that have come out. Chartered institutions are required to also have a separate audit committee that kind of does the auditing internally for the organization. Usually we would suggest organizations have a combined finance and audit committee, but it's something to sort of have an extra functionality because you're a chartered institution. The board is ultimately responsible for making sure that the organization has the resources that it needs to carry out its work, right? And so ultimately, the board should be responsible for making sure you have a fundraising plan, for identifying how the board can support those fundraising goals, for making sure that you've got staff support or volunteer support for doing that. And being, you know, strategic. And fundraising is also about, yes, it's about events and it's about relationship building, but it can also be about donor development and donor cultivation, and should have a really thoughtful plan and strategy for how you're going to raise money. Board members are also ambassadors for the organization. They bring information from the board to the community. They build relationships with community members on behalf of the organization. They promote the organization, they're ambassadors. They build the relationships with donors and funders and, you know, perhaps corporate or sponsors. So that connection in terms of really making sure that the board understands the organization, that the board knows how the organization is funded, who its board members are, who its major, you know, grant makers are, and what the major programs of the organization might be. The board is also responsible for ensuring that your programs and services are in alignment with your mission, that you are good stewards of your collections, that you have good policies and procedures in place for making sure that those you know, collections are well stewarded, that the programs are meeting the mission, that you have evaluation mechanisms in place, that you don't sort of wander off into mission drift, and that you stay focused on what's important and meaningful for your organization. And then, of course, strategic planning, which is really important in making sure that you have the viability and sustainability of your organization, that you know where you're headed, that you've created a roadmap so that everyone is on the same page, and that it's not just, you know, 10 or 12 or 15 people on the board with each with a unique idea of where you're headed, but that you have a shared consensus and plan for the future. So as we now move into really thinking about board governance and recruitment, I want you to also think about all of these different functions and how important it is to have a board with a broad knowledge and understanding of a lot of different issues, not just your specific program and your mission. Obviously, they need to be passionate about history, about storytelling, about collections, about your local, you know, community, but they also need to bring a set of important skills and a commitment and willingness to carry out some of this kind of work. So when we think about board development, right, many people say, we have a nominating committee. And what they're really doing is talking about one component of the recruitment process, one component of the board development process. But if you think about it holistically, what we're doing is talking about board development as an ongoing process of creating, maintaining, and improving the functioning, effectiveness, and productivity of board leadership and board governance. And that changes over time. That changes as organizations grow, as they bring on new staff, as they bring on new board members. And so it's important to really think about you know, the role of the board as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago isn't necessarily the role of the board that you're going to need 5 or 10 years from now or next year, right? And so part of what you want to think about is really assessing and planning for your board composition, for your board effectiveness, for really board development in general. And then once you have a good understanding of the skills and the connections and the commitments on your board, you can go out and recruit and nominate people who have the skills and connections that you need. And then once you've gone and brought people on and nominated them, you want to bring them on and orient and train them. You want to make sure that you are bringing people on in a welcoming environment, that you have given them as much information as possible about the organization and the role of the board as possible to get them acclimated. And I think many organizations, when they have long-term board members, they forget about this. They just sort of bring new people on, they come to their first meeting and business continues as normal without creating space for recognizing that there's new people around the table. And that often isn't very welcoming and isn't really a great way for people to getting up to speed as quickly as possible. Also providing ongoing training, really training, it kind of goes throughout this cycle here, around topics that are particularly of interest to you. So those might be fundraising, those might be board development like this. They might be how to read a financial statement. They might be about your collections and about your archives. They might be specific to your history. So that part of the ongoing training is really valuable for all of your board members. And then you want to think about making sure you're engaging people meaningfully through the work of the organization. It might be project specific, it might be committee based, but really make sure that people have a way of being engaged and feel like their skills and talents are being used effectively and appropriately. And when that happens, it also provides you with the opportunity for people to build skills and develop leadership within the organization. And so, you know, hopefully when you're thinking about the assessing and planning and recruiting phase, you're also thinking about the messaging and telling people that we want to bring board members on who are able and willing to serve in a leadership capacity when asked, because we want succession planning, we want new ideas and new blood, and we need new leadership. And so it needs to be very intentional as you're going forward. And then the cycle continues. You know, for most organizations, there's an annual kind of, you know, for your annual meeting, you know, go through this process so that you can recruit and nominate people at that meeting, but then the rest of this work continues throughout the year. And so what we usually suggest is really an ongoing board development committee that meets on a regular basis. But in terms of board development, you know, one of the things you want to make sure that you do is to monitor your bylaws, to comply with your bylaws, to review them and amend them as necessary. So, for instance, laws, at least in the last 6 years, you're not compliant with the Nonprofit Revitalization Act, right? So that's definitely something to think about. But your bylaws are a living, breathing document, and they should be reviewed and made sure that you're compliant on a regular basis. They should be thorough and comprehensive enough to give you good guidance in your decision-making and your operations as a board. One of the things that's really helpful for bringing on board members and holding board members accountable is to develop a board job description, to identify specifically what are the qualifications that you need from your board members, what are the performance and expectations and the standards of performance that you're expecting. You can't hold people accountable unless you clearly communicate that, right? Particularly in fundraising. If you have a give-get, that's an important thing to communicate. If you ask board members to give a gift of personal significance or to actively participate in their board development, in fundraising activities, you need to let them know how they can do that. You want to think strategically about your board development goals, both short-term and long-term. I think what's really important to understand is that board development doesn't happen overnight. That you can make change over time, but you certainly don't want to alienate the people who have been active and providing leadership. You want to think about, taking it slowly and really thinking about the culture change that might need to happen. And this is one of those things where when you're trying to get your board perhaps more involved in fundraising, or when you are trying to establish term limits, those are all things that sometimes take longer than you would expect, or implement new committees or a committee process. You want to think about how well the board is functioning in relation to its goals, and think about whether and how to assess individual board member and officer performance. It can be really sensitive, right, to do that. But you also want to be cognizant of the fact that if you have board members who are not participating, who are taking up a seat perhaps that someone else could, should, or would fill, and they're just a warm body, what you're really doing is creating a sort of disheartening situation for those board members who are active and engaged. And the same thing with officers. If you have officers who aren't providing the leadership that you need, or are taking you in a more, in a different direction, or who have been there for 10 years, you want to just think about that and be really intentional and respectful, obviously, as part of that process. Part of that is really around proactively managing communications with board members and officers regarding renewal of terms or retirement. It can, many of our organizations don't have term limits, but you do have terms. Terms range from you serve for 1 year, you might serve for 2 or 3 years, and then your term renews. Don't take it for granted that people want to renew their terms. And if people are not engaged or involved in the way that you want, that you don't take it for granted that the organization should consider renewing their term, that it should be an opportunity to reflect on whether they want to stay, whether maybe they've been on for a really long time and they want to retire or take a step back, or maybe instead of being on the board, they just want to help out with a particular committee or project. So just be intentional about those communications with board members. You also want to think about designing and implementing the orientation process that should be done by board members as well as the executive director, if you have an executive director. It should be a time when the board, all board members get together and renew the bylaws and renew perhaps review your strategic plan, review the board's job description, review your priorities for the upcoming year. Understanding how has this, COVID situation affected your organization, and what are you doing strategically to address it and respond to it. You want to think about encouraging and coordinating ongoing development opportunities. So, for instance, some organizations have a board in service at every meeting. They might spend 15 minutes doing some kind of a learning situation where you learn how to read a balance sheet, for instance, or one of the committees does a deeper dive on a particular issue or area, or the treasurer does you know, something about how to better read your budget or what it means. Or it could be something related to your programs and your mission so that you better understand what you're doing over the next year. And that learning process builds teamwork, and it builds commitment to the organization, and it helps board members be better board members. You also want to think about really being proactive about recruiting and nominating board members and officers, that the recruitment process isn't something that just happens in the month or two before your annual meeting, that it really should be an ongoing, thoughtful process, very intentional, as you meet people, that maybe you think about using your committees to engage non-board members, you know, but that you're intentional about it, not last minute, and that you create the expectation of having perhaps a board development committee working on it, or even if it is the board as a whole, working on it, making sure it's on your agenda at board meetings, and that everybody is aware of the skills that you're looking for in potential board members. You also want to think about multi-year leadership succession planning. And, you know, there are different organizations have different strategies. So some organizations have a board president for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And succession planning for them is really challenging because they are essentially a de facto staff person in many cases. And that essentially they've created a position, or the board has created a position that is really developed for their skill set, for their experience. And sometimes what needs to happen is that the organization needs to think strategically about who the next president perhaps might be, and what the responsibilities of that president actually are, and whether those shoes can realistically be filled or they need to be scaled back, and responsibilities need to be delegated among other board members so that they're more fair, so that you're not asking someone to step into a job that is that big. Other organizations have term limits where board officers, treasurer, or president, secretary might only serve a year or 2 or 3, and then they utilize their leadership committee structure for succession planning. So the vice president is essentially being groomed to become the president, or perhaps the chair of your finance committee, who is not your treasurer, is being groomed to become your treasurer, so that you can be intentional about it. And so regardless of what your model is, you really need to think about leadership development, succession planning, and making sure that you're creating the expectation that people will fill those roles, that the vice president role isn't just a placeholder, that it really is part of that leadership development process. And then, as I said earlier, I think it's important to establish a committee that is charged with the full spectrum of board development activities, whether you call it a governance committee or a board development committee, as we recommend. You can call it a nominating committee, but you want to be cognizant that it should include all of these activities. So the first step in that is in developing a needs assessment for your organization, right? So you want to think about who currently is on your board. What are their skills? What are their talents? What responsibilities do they have? Do you have people who are retired curators or retired archivists? Or do are they going to be rolling off soon? Do you need to find new people with those areas of expertise? About your board, structure, your board culture. What are board members willing and able to do What kind of leadership can they provide to other new board members? And then you want to think about the influence and the contacts and the representation that you want for the board, for the organization. If you're moving into different kind of programming, you need to think about different kinds of activities. One of the things that's really big and important right now is to think about the diversity and inclusion and equity work that your organization might be doing. Do you have ethnic or racial diversity of your community? Do you have, different religious perspectives? Do you have age diversity? For many historical societies and museums, age diversity is really critical, that the board tends to be 60s and 70s, and that they're not necessarily effectively engaging younger people or families. And so thinking strategically about the diversity and representation you want on your board to better reflect the interests and needs of the community, as well as, making sure that the organization is providing programming that would be of relevance and interest to the community. And then, for your board, thinking also about geography, how important is that to your organization, whether it's at the local neighborhood level or the county level or the state level. And then, do you have a diversity of perspectives, whether they're political perspectives or philosophical perspectives or industry perspectives? You want to make sure that your board gives you the diversity of expertise and opinions that you need. So one suggestion is really, and this is a resource that we can share with you that goes out, is to develop a checklist of current board members' skills, and their knowledge, their connections, and also develop a list of potential candidates who meet the identified needs, whether it's in fundraising or marketing or program development or grant writing or whatever it might be for your organization. So once you've done that and you've identified the kinds of board members you might want to think about, then you want to think about how do you extend your network. That very often boards basically go directly to the people that board members know. So there's one layer out from the current board members. And what you want to try to do is really think about diversifying beyond just the network of your board members. For those of you who are membership organizations, obviously your membership provides a great resource list in terms of engaging people, that, having conversations with them, with reaching out and letting them know, hey, we're looking for people with this kind of connections or these skills or these perspectives can be very helpful. One thing that you might not know about is we have a website called Charity Strong that is an online, essentially match.com for nonprofit boards. And it provides the opportunity for nonprofits to register there and for individuals to register themselves there as looking for potential board members. So if you register your organization there, it'll be a great resource. You can promote that you're looking for board members and define what kind of knowledge and skills and all of that you are interested in. When you're starting with your board members' networks or affiliations, one thing that can be really helpful to think about is it's not just who your board members know that they can go to and say, hey, Jane, will you be on the board? It's saying, hey, Jane, do you know anybody who's really interested in local history and who has some experience with grant writing or with fundraising events or with developing a fundraising plan or who knows something about our local history, right? And you're using their networks as a launch pad rather than kind of the dead end, right? So it's a fork in the road rather than a dead end. As I mentioned earlier, reaching out to your members and your donors, your visitors, and their networks is a really great place to start. You know, those folks on a local level are probably ones that are, you know, already interested in your organization. And then you can also think about the other nonprofits or religious or community groups in your area who maybe you partner with some of them. Maybe you want somebody who's a teacher in a local school district, or you know, who works at one, you know, you can get connected with one of the local religious institutions and they can have one of their groups, you know, partner with to support your organization. Or maybe some of those churches have folks who might be interested in joining. Don't always just go to the leaders, right? You might need to go to the congregants, for instance. If you have, you know, universities or colleges in your community, they can be really great resources. You might be able to find professors or staff members with an interest in your mission. Some local government folks, you know, particularly, they have their own ethics considerations, but as long as they're not a direct funder of your organization, you know, getting people from local government or county government or even state government can be a great resource. Some organizations just post on their, you know, outside their facility, you know, looking for board members, interested, call us. Some organizations have an open house or they bring it up at their membership meetings. You know, some organizations put it in their newsletters, for instance, or on their website. And then, you know, you can think about a great board development process, recruitment process, is to have non-board members serving on select committees so that you are essentially vetting them and you're providing an opportunity for potential board members to learn about the organization, get involved, eventually come onto the board, and then you have an opportunity for board members who are perhaps rolling off to stay involved with the organization by participating in committees that they're interested in. So it really is a great resource that way. One thing that you can do is to put newer board members on your board development committee because they already reflect a diversified audience, because they also are much closer to understanding what new board members need to be prepared, so they can really help with the orientation process. And then, you know, the other thing to think about is if you have people who are experts in, you know, either archival preservation or fundraising or other kinds of activities, but they don't want to make the full board commitment, you can involve them either on an advisory, you know, in an advisory group or on committees or just as an ad hoc resource. Don't put them on your board because then they're not going to be able to fulfill the overall goals, and they're going to be discouraged and the board will be discouraged. But find a good place for them, either advisory to staff or advisory to the board, or both for that matter. Many local communities, the United Way or the Chamber of Commerce, offers leadership or volunteer programs. And so those are definitely some great, you know, resources. Some local hospitals have good volunteer programs where they're trying to get their staff involved in nonprofits as well. So, you know, find out where there are some leadership development programs happening and reach out to them. And then just the thing that I notice is boards don't actually spend the time brainstorming potential board members, potential strategies for recruiting board members, you know, that you really want to make this part and parcel on a routine basis. And so just spend the time, put it on the agenda, bring it from the committee to the full board or just to the full board if you don't have a committee. And really think about that. Engage your committees in that process. Ask them to recommend, particularly if you have non-board members, ask those folks to recommend potential board members. All right. I think one thing that's really important when you're going out and recruiting board members is to clarify and educate your community about board service. That there are many personal and professional benefits from serving on the board. There's a lot of work, yes, but there's also, you learn a lot, you feel good about what you're doing, and you're meeting both, their own sort of, professional and personal development goals, but also they're helping to, carry out the work of the organization and fulfill some missing links in that organization. So what you want to think about is developing a compelling case for what your board does and the value it provides to the organization, the community, people's quality of life. You want to tell that story. You want to give people a sense of the importance of serving on the board. And just really, helping them understand the value and benefits of the board, and also address misperceptions that many people don't know about what being on the board is. They think they have to be rich. They think that they don't have the experience or the qualifications. Or for some organizations, it seems so much like a club that new board members aren't welcome. And so I think being very intentional about that is really important, and making sure that you have a clear understanding of what people's perceptions of your board is very important. Are you respected? Are you seen as important? Have you told the story of all of the work that the board is doing to help the organization? It's important to recognize that you understand that there's a give and a get, and I don't mean a quid pro quo, but that board members give, as you know, a lot of time and hopefully their expertise. They lend credibility to the organization. They can help influence the organization, as well as help expand the organization's influence and reach in the community. They can provide resources either directly or by providing access to other resources. And hopefully you expect that they have a commitment to excellence, right? That they are willing and able to carry out their legal and fiduciary responsibilities. But it's important that your board understands that for people to stay, for people to be committed, people need to feel personally satisfied. They need to feel like they're valued, that their work is, meaningful and making a difference. That they may feel like they're able to, help accomplish something. They have a commitment to your mission and to the work that you're doing. For some people, they might want professional growth or networking opportunities. And, certainly, there are particularly younger potential board members might want to join boards because they want to expand their professional network and their personal network. And as long as they're not doing business at the board meetings and with the board and expecting kind of quid pro quos, that should be perfectly acceptable and allowable to use it as a learning and professional and personal development opportunity, since that's what it is for all of us. There are some businesses that see putting putting staff members on a board gives them a benefit in the community. So banks have long done this, certainly maybe some hospitals, maybe universities. So look at some of the larger employers in your community and see whether they have some kind of a community leadership development program. And then some board members want recognition for their work. They like to be the center of attention. They want to be recognized and valued and appreciated. And other board members like to be behind the scenes. So it's just important to understand what kind of recognition to give board members. But this give and this take here is just an important balance, recognizing that we need to understand this and communicate what we're expecting from board members and what we are committed to giving to our board members as an organization. Okay, so a few thoughts on making the case for board service. You know, board members gain expertise on complex issues that essentially are integral to business and to the economy. That nonprofits are, you know, we are business entities, we are legal entities, we have regulations in terms of oversight by lots of different entities, whether it's Department of Labor, the Board of Regents, the Attorney General's office, you know, and IRS and others. It's a really great opportunity for learning about business and the economy. You know, how for people, how is the impact of COVID really coming down on our local nonprofits, on our local community? What is that going to mean? How can we address that? Those are all really important strategic questions our boards need to be looking at. Looking at the different systems that we work in, right? Understanding things like marketing and fundraising, things like, you know, event planning, networking, relationship building, really learning how your organization is making a difference and being able to connect their involvement in decision making and in the committee work that they're doing to seeing the impact. All of this provides really great opportunities for on-the-job training, professional development, conflict resolution, understanding how to make formal decisions, you know, learning how to develop a budget, how to monitor a budget, how to read a balance sheet. All of these things are incredibly powerful skill sets that you don't usually get, you know, as a complete package. I think, you know, really looking at the networking opportunities and relationships. You know, many people join boards because they want to give back. They want to get involved. They want to, maybe if they're retired, they want to stay connected to their community. So, you know, board service can be fun, but it can also be a great, you know, way of connecting and making a difference. And so thinking about making the case for board service and making it a win-win, and the messaging is really important when you're going out and asking people to join the board. And we'll talk more about that in a second. All right. So as you're going through your board development process and before you meet with someone, you really want to develop and organize pertinent materials. Essentially, you're selling the organization to people. You're engaging in a conversation. You want to think about what your application and interview process is. Be clear on messaging. Make sure that board members who are talking to prospective board members understand that. So whether you're saying, you know, you don't want to go to somebody and say, well, you join our board. You want to say, we're looking for potential board members. We are interested in people with these this skill set. You know, this is what we're doing as an organization. This is our process. We want you to maybe fill out an application. You'll have the opportunity to meet with a couple of board members in an interview and discuss it and explore whether it's a good process for you and for us, right? So it becomes a win-win. So make sure people are clear on that and they're not going out and just inviting people to join the board. When you're you know, establishing board member expectations, you really want to know what your pitch is, right? If you're saying, you know, we're a great group of people and we meet once a month and we eat great food and it's not that much work, what you're doing is saying your time isn't meaningful, our time isn't important, and we just want a warm body, right? That isn't going to be very much a good sales pitch for someone who wants to make a difference. So really think about your pitch, think about, you know, what you want to say to someone. And it's, you know, it's a great thing to go and say to people, you know, we are a board that works really hard. We're committed and passionate about our organization. And we think you have some amazing skills that can really complement our board. And we'd love, you know, to talk about whether that's a good fit for you and for us, and how you might, you know, help our organization. Like your budget, your funding sources. Every board member should know your top 3 funding sources, should know, you know, who's on the board, should have a good, clear set of your program description and the impacts that those programs are having. There's a question here. Any advice for how to diplomatically but effectively deal with a board member who's not pulling their weight, or even lying, deceiving the rest of the board on their activities? That's a really hard one. I mean, and I think, you know, part of it is creating clear standards of what participation is. So, you know, obviously, are they coming to board meetings? Are they attending committee meetings? Are they making a financial gift of personal significance? Has their assignment been very clear and very explicit? Like, we're having an event, go to 3, you know, liquor stores and get as many bottles of wine as you can. And are there, you know, clear evaluation mechanisms? It's really challenging. And I think that's kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about one thing that's the simplest way is around terms. If you have an annual term or 2 or 3 year terms, at the end of that term period, if there's a board committee or board members actively involved in evaluating the board, it's a great opportunity to say to that person, thank you so much for your service. You know, we really appreciate it, and we're not going to renew your term, or maybe there's a better way of your getting involved since you haven't been able to meet the expectations. Sometimes, you know, I think certainly lying or deceiving the board is, you know, takes it to another level. And I think that's where, you know, the board needs to really trust each other and trust themselves. And that's where it can get destructive. So, you know, I think holding people accountable is really hard. That's the job of the president to do. It's not the job of an executive director to hold the board accountable. The board needs to hold itself accountable. And it can be awkward and hard, particularly in small communities. So it needs to be done respectfully and honestly, but I think it also just needs to be done, like maybe it's not a good time for you right now, and when you think you can meet these obligations, we'd love to have you back, you know. And each situation is very distinct. So I hope that was a little bit helpful, and I'd be happy to further discuss that at the end of the session too. You want to think about who is the best person to reach out to a prospective board member. Usually it's the person who's most familiar with them, or maybe the board or a committee chair. If it's the executive director, and you know, I just want to say the executive director plays a really valuable and important role in helping to identify prospective board members. They're out in the community, they know people, they're thinking about this, but they shouldn't be the only one doing this. This should really be a board, you know, responsibility. And so if it's the executive director, how can that executive director connect the prospective board member to a current board member for discussions? And then, you know, if board members haven't, or prospective board members, candidates haven't been involved, invite them to get to know the organization. Make sure that they have gone on a tour, or give them a special, you know, tour of what's going on. Show them the best you know, the best way of seeing the organization, what you do, the impacts, show them some highlights, you know, just make sure to kind of introduce them to your organization and what you do, and find out from them what is interesting about what the organization does. There's a question about the best method to initiate the pitch, in person or in writing. You know, I think in person is always great. One of the things that I think realistically and pragmatically, certainly, is, to be able to send an email to somebody and say, hey, we're in the process of doing some board development and I would love to pick your brain. Do you have time to meet me for coffee or a walk or a phone call or whatever it might be? And this way, you're giving them the heads up about what you're asking them for. You're not asking them for anything specific. You're just asking. So I think, it can be either way. Ultimately, you want to do the due diligence. You want to get to know each other. And so doing that, either in person or by telephone or Zoom is probably preferable than just having it be an email exchange. Okay, so, these are just some questions that you should be prepared for as a board member going out to talk to prospective board members, right? They might want to know who else is on your board. They might, want to know whether it's a good working team, whether they think they would like the people, whether they know anybody on the board. What are your board meetings like, right? Do you meet monthly? Do you meet every other month? Do you meet quarterly? If you're an all-volunteer board, or even if you're not, are your board meetings always focused on activities and events and operational issues, or are you focused on, strategic and governance related issues? Is there a clarity in the distinction of those issues? People might want to know, are you fiscally sound, right? Are they getting involved with an organization that is fiscally responsible? Do you have a lot of debts or liabilities? Are you running in a deficit? They might want to see your Form 990, or if you have an audit, they might want to see that, get a better sense, particularly if you're asking people to get involved who have financial expertise. They're going to want to ask those questions, right? They're going to want to get a better sense. If you're asking them to join your finance committee or come in as a treasurer or something like that, they should get access to some good information. They might want to know, is your organization in crisis? And do you have a plan for addressing those? And some people love dealing with crisis. They want to come into an organization, they want to fix it, turn around, and leave. Other people don't want to do crisis work. They want to come into a healthy organization and really fit right in and move forward. And so, being clear with people can be really valuable, so that you get people who are understanding where you're at and can help in the right ways. They might want to know what your board's major goals and challenges and plans are, right? So what are you working on programmatically? Do you have a capital campaign going on? Do you need new staffing? Are you going to have an executive transition soon? What are you working on? Are you doing a new exhibit? What's new? What are the time, commitment, participation, and expectation standards? This is an important conversation to have at your board level. So for instance, for some organizations, they say, okay, we meet monthly as a board. We expect everyone to participate on a committee. And then there's volunteer or fundraising or other preparation work. So, we have an hour-and-a-half board meeting, an hour-and-a-half committee meeting, plus some prep time. That's 2 hours each, plus 2 hours additional time. And those are our expectation standards. For other organizations, they need people to volunteer and help out. They need people to be much more involved in fundraising and lead a campaign or develop a fundraising event. So being clear about that is important, so that people can say yes and mean it and commit to it, or they can get involved in ways that they can meet those expectations. If you have staff, what is the relationship between the board and the executive director? Is it a good working relationship? Is there a partnership? Do they see the future the same way? Does the organization have good relationships with other entities, such as nonprofits or government, businesses? Do you have partnerships? Is there acrimony? Is there collaboration? Just being clear on those kinds of things. As I mentioned, thinking about volunteer time beyond board meetings. I've worked with organizations who really think about this in many different ways. So one organization I worked with said, we are limiting the amount of volunteer time board members can do to one volunteer shift a month for 2 hours. For another organization, they're saying, we want board members to volunteer at least a 4-hour work shift a month, right? And so that means that board member coming on has to know how much time they need to contribute beyond board service. And then one important question is, do you have directors and officers liability insurance? If the organization is sued, is there insurance that will help to protect the board and to settle any issues? So those are some questions that are typical ones that we hear that can challenge a board. And so you want to make sure to be prepared to answer those questions. You also want to think about going to talk to board members and maybe say, what do they know about your organization? How does our mission interest you? What do you know about history? What experiences have you had? What would you like to do to make a difference? What are your previous board experiences, if any? What were they like? It doesn't mean having previous board experience isn't necessarily good or bad, right? Some board experiences are very different than others. Some are very much governance only, some are very mixed, some are very formal, some are very informal, but it's important to understand what those experiences were and what their expectations about how boards run, so that you can clarify and make sure that you're on the same page. What do they feel they can contribute to the board team? What difference would they like to make for your on the organization? How do they see themselves being involved? Given your expectations, do they have any concerns or limitations? I mean, some of these are very basic, like our board meets the second Tuesday of every month at 5:30 p.m. If they are a professor and teaches generally at that time frame, it probably won't work for them, right? Or you may have a culture as a board that changes your meeting schedule, which I don't advise, but for instance, I serve on the board of a local organization, and pretty much, 5 out of 7 of us are professors, and so every semester we have to revisit the meeting schedule depending on their teaching schedules. So that becomes a challenge. But, do they have concerns about their ability to give at a certain level, right? If you have to be a member at the $500 level, can they financially afford that? Or can they participate in a committee? Can they help with fundraising activities? And then, just as you're moving closer towards sealing the deal, are they able and willing to carry them out, right? Does it make sense? Are they clear? And so having a good dialogue before you bring people on is really important, serves as a good orientation, right? And helps you feel confident, helps you be knowledgeable, so that when you're bringing it back to the board development committee or the board, you can make the case for why this person would be a good asset for the board. Once you bring people onto the board, you want to really create a welcome, inclusive, and participatory environment. You don't want to just go forward as business as usual. This is one of the reasons why, although some boards bring on board members throughout the year, if you do it once a year and you bring on 2 or 3 or 4 people at a time, you can add a level of formality that bringing on people one-on-one doesn't really accomplish. Having an orientation session for them, for the all of the board members, kind of creating that board team as part of that. Letting the person have one-on-one meetings with board leadership and staff leadership. having some ongoing training sessions about the organization, about what it means to be a board member. One thing that can be great is pre-board service. So for instance, on Nikon's board, our board members are elected in October at our annual meeting, but their terms don't start until January. So during October, November, and December, they can attend any board or committee meetings that they want to kind of get up to speed without having that fiduciary responsibility. Our board has sort of thought about using that kind of, you know, November finance committee meeting as a great way of educating the board, new board members, as well as transitioning from, you know, what we're predicting for the close of the fiscal year to the new budget development in the next year. So it's a great way of involving people before they have to join the board. Having a longer-term board member who's their mentor, who they can sit next to or have coffee with and ask questions can be really helpful. Doing an annual board retreat for keeping people engaged. And then just reaching out to people. If people aren't coming to meetings, or if they're not following through on what they said they would do, holding them accountable, communicating with them respectfully, but you know, really finding out, is there any information or support we can provide you? One thing I'll tell you is that if you're assigning people who have not been involved in the organization to be a committee chair, they're going to need a lot of support, right? And so making sure that people are supported as committee chairs or in their committee roles is important. Make sure the committees know what they're charged with doing. And really provide them with some support. Maybe the vice president can help the president, you know, support committees. And then one thing that's really valuable is a board manual. And this can be an actual physical manual. It can be an online Google document. But essentially, you're providing all of the information that board members might need or want that you review as part of that orientation. So your bylaws, your articles of incorporation and amendments and the charter, your minutes of past, you know, 6 months of past board meetings, your audit and your 990, your financial reports, your major organizational policies, collections policies, for instance, personnel policies, your committee meeting schedule for the year, board job description, what are the expectations, a board member list and their contacts and how to reach them, committee assignments, you know, who's on which committees. And then the Attorney General's Charity Bureau has a document called Right from the Start that is a good resource for board members to all be given. There was a question about how large is the Nikon board. So our board is fairly large. I think we have about 20, 21 people right now. So certainly, you know, it's easier with larger boards to think about bringing on larger groups of people on an annual basis. If you only, let's say, have 7 or 9 people and most of them either, and you don't have term limits, that makes it much more challenging. So not all solutions work for all organizations, but it's definitely, you know, a good resource. You know, for smaller organizations, bringing on people, it's all the more important to orient people and bring them on and create that welcoming, participatory environment, because smaller boards feel much more like a club, right? They feel exclusive. And so unless that person is really brought in and made to feel welcome, given a good job, you know, a role on a committee, and supported, it's gonna take them a while to get used to things as well. So some of the things to keep board members, you know, involved, to keep them on the board and retained. Just part of what you're trying to do is formalize your board process, right? You're creating a sum that's greater than the parts. So make sure you have a standing meeting and committee calendar for the year. That, you know, it's not just that you're looking at each other at the committee level and saying, when are we going to meet next? It's the board meets the first Tuesday of every other month. Committees, you know, the finance committee meets, you know, Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. The collections committee meets at noon on every other, you know, on Fridays, every other month, whatever it might be. Put together a board oversight calendar so that you know on an annual basis, what does the board need to do in January, February, March? What do the committees need to do? So that essentially you know when you need to prepare your annual budget, when you need to prepare for your audit, when you need to prepare for board nominations, when you need to prepare for your annual meeting or your membership meeting. So put together a calendar with those major organizational activities and share that, and that can be part of your manual, that can be monitored at every board meeting, so that everybody's kind of focused on moving forward. The annual retreat is a great resource where you get together and you think about what are our priorities for the next year. It may be for big picture strategic planning, it may be for reviewing your progress, and developing the next year's priorities. It may be for board development and recruitment, training, but having a board retreat where you get together and spend a few hours, you know, outside of a board meeting, outside of a committee meeting, where you're building connections with each other and the organization and the bigger picture goals is really valuable. You know, have regular board assessment and training in terms of the skills and knowledge that people are looking for, how to improve, how to be engaged. If, you know, this is really important around fundraising. It's the area where most boards members, you know, are like uncomfortable. They don't really want to do it. They don't like it. And they want more training, that the organization has the responsibility to provide them with that. Really thinking it through, really developing a concrete action plan, and making sure people build their confidence level and have clear tasks, clear responsibilities around fundraising, because otherwise people are going to avoid it like the plague. We talked about regular in-services, maybe it's 15 minutes at every meeting or every other meeting. You know, making sure your meeting agendas are good and strategic and that they're productive meetings, that you don't allow one person to dominate the conversation or to take you in a direction that you don't want to go. Make sure that people feel heard and involved. Essentially, that someone has done some thinking to know what you want to accomplish as part of that board meeting, right? Whether what decisions need to be made, what assignments need to be given, you know, really making it clear in terms of just, you know, what you want to accomplish and that you don't lose sight of that. And sometimes having the executive committee meet beforehand can be very valuable. Sometimes it's the president and the executive director who are doing that, or the committee chair and the executive director, but really think about making your meeting, you know, valuable and know what you want to get out of them so that they feel productive. Also, I want to say distinguish between governance and operational issues. So if you're an all-volunteer board, or if your board addresses a lot of operational issues, have your governance things first. Have your board development committee report, have your finance committee report, and then talk about the program calendar for the season or the webinars that you're going to be doing or whatever it might be. And then I think it's really important that board members feel informed and engaged and not surprised. If there are big issues, don't keep them secret. If you think you might be losing a grant that you've had for a long time, or you lost a big donor, or if the organization is in a financial crisis because of COVID, you know, you need to engage your board, you need to communicate with them and make sure that they are bought into solving the problems and not surprised at the last minute with, you know, information. You also want to think about a board leadership development plan. So establish clear expectations for leadership service as part of the ongoing recruitment process. Make sure that they're prepared for that. Communicate, you know, we really want board members who are able and willing to, you know, become president or treasurer or committee chair if and when asked. You want to think about succession planning for officers and committee chairs. And so who's going to be, you know, making sure your vice president is going to become president. Don't just put someone there who isn't going to be, or make sure you have a plan B. Committee chairs, thinking about, you know, maybe someone else on the committee is a vice committee chair or assistant chair or just being groomed. Committee chair can perhaps become an officer. Really looking at, you know, I mentioned this earlier, having maybe an assistant treasurer or having a committee chair of your finance committee not being the treasurer so that they can grow into that position. Think about how new officers are oriented by their predecessors and what information needs to be transferred. So some organizations, they have a binder for each of the officers, for the president, for the secretary, for the treasurer. Certainly for the vice president might be good as well. But this way, there's a formalized orientation process from one officer to the next officer, and so that it isn't lost. And having a shared Google Drive or something like that is certainly helpful for providing access. Many times when you have long-term officers or committee chairs, they, you know, they've kept it close to their vest. And so part of that is making sure that they are turning over the relevant materials. And that's true of committee chairs as well. If you have somebody who's been chair of your event committee, you know, has that committee documented what needs to happen for each event or each activity, for the gala, for instance, so that it's a success when they're not part of it and driving that agenda. Many organizations have an immediate past president role so that you can essentially mentor the president. Maybe that person can chair the fundraising committee or the board development committee or a capital campaign committee. And this way you keep them involved in a little bit longer way. If you have term limits, you know, that's a great resource, but certainly following your terms, making sure that people serve for, you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years. Otherwise, it becomes a whole other challenge, you know, if people have served for a much longer period of time. Use your leadership development plan to honor long-term board service. And this can be a great way of rolling people off the board who aren't able to continue to contribute, is to say, you've been on the board for 15 years, 20 years. We'd love to honor your service. We'd love to do it as a fundraiser. We'd love to help you transition into an honorary committee role so that you can involve our major donors. You know, there's many things that you can think about doing to honor long-term board service and get people to kind of roll off who aren't able to continue, or who are perhaps stuck in the way we've always done it and not able or willing to take on and do things new in new ways. And then, of course, you know, manage your communication, manage your messaging well so that, you know, people are clear about what you're trying to do. There is another sort of suggestion, question here. Yeah, there's always some questions and concerns about what to do and how to deal with, you know, challenges and unethical behavior, or how to formally remove board members. You know, hopefully you've got a clause in your bylaws that does enable you or allow you to do that. It really becomes a challenge. You can have, you know, removing board members for cause or without cause. Usually, you know, you want to remove people with a 2/3 majority vote. You know, and it can be incredibly disruptive and destructive when you've got internal sort of, you know, camps essentially. And so I think, you know, sometimes you can only do what you can do, and organizations need to play out the way they need to. Sometimes bringing in an outside facilitator can help when there are serious, you know, board questions or board challenges. You know, and sometimes individual board members just need to decide that it's not a positive experience. Hopefully that's not, you know, typical, and that, you know, there is great discussion and dialogue, and that really, you know, decision making and you know, debate is constructive and productive and in the best interest of the organization. So just in terms of wrapping up, and then we can have any further questions, feel free to type in additional thoughts or questions into or any tips that you might have for the other folks on the webinar. One thing is, you will get a copy of the presentation. Share it with your fellow board members. Ask for 15 minutes or a half an hour on the agenda to share the PowerPoint, and tell them what you think would be most useful for your organization. Think about going to Charity Strong and register your organization. If you don't have a board development committee that addresses those full ranges of tasks, think about updating your bylaws or your committee charters to include all of them. You know, I don't care whether you call it a nominating or governance committee, but just make sure that you're really addressing all of those kinds of issues. And then I think recognize that change takes time, and that it can't happen overnight, and, you know, give yourselves an action plan that moves you forward slowly with annual goals and multi-year goals, so that, you know, you can be effective and productive and grow the organization. It's organizational development, and it's not easy. Takes time. So let's see, are there any? You're welcome for addressing the governance versus operational issues. I know that's a huge challenge for either all volunteer or largely volunteer organizations. So important to think that through and make it work for your organization. All right, well, I'll give it another minute, but thanks everyone. Feel free to sign off. Or if you do want to stay on for another minute with a question, feel free to do that as well. All right, well then I think what we'll do is end the webinar, and thanks so much everybody for joining us, and best wishes to you all.